Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Kevin Shane. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director at Male Contraceptive Initiative, and welcome to our latest edition of the Lemonade Stand. This is our somewhat monthly webinar series that we started early on in the dark days of COVID last year as a way to kind of keep the community connected and to kind of just share the different work from stakeholders involved in the broader male contraception and male reproductive biology ecosystem to come on, share their work, and just give us an opportunity to connect with each other and continue kind of just networking as we continue this virtual reality that we live in. So today we're super excited to have Rene Almeling join us to present her work. She's an associate professor of sociology at Yale University and the author of the book Gynecology: The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Biology. And to really kind of not only talk about her work in authoring the book, but also the kind of ramifications and implications of what this lack of basic understanding about men's reproductive biology has on reproductive justice, reproductive politics, and of course for us, the lack of progress in developing male contraceptives. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick it over to Rene. What we're going to do is have her talk for about 35-40 minutes, followed by about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A and conversation. If you could, please use the raise hand feature if you have a question to ask, or you can type it in the chat and I can ask it for you. And also, as always, you can find in the next few days, we will upload this video to our YouTube channel and house the video on our webinars page on our website, so you can check out all of the past and future offerings of the Lemonade Stand, and reach out to us if you have any questions, any suggestions for future offerings, things of that nature. So once again, thank you all for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you, Rene. So thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today, and to Logan and Kevin and Heather for doing all of the organizational background work that it takes to put these things on, even if we're all just sort of clicking the button to join on our computers. So I'm speaking to you today from New Haven, Connecticut. I am a professor of sociology at Yale University, and I'm going to share a couple slides here. So I hope that you can see the slideshow. Is that, Kevin, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides? Perfect, thank you. So I'm located in the sociology department at Yale, but I have courtesy appointments in American Studies, the School of Public Health, and the School of Medicine section on the history of medicine. If you hang out on Twitter, you can find me at Almeling, occasionally tweeting about gender, medicine, genetics, and now men's reproductive health. So I've put together just a couple of slides. This will be a somewhat more informal talk than I typically do. I'm interested in sort of giving you a flavor of some of the research that I did for the book, but very much looking forward to sort of the discussion and questions and answers. So it's kind of hard to do interrupting questions during Zoom, but I'll plan to speak for 20 or 25 minutes, and then we can open it up, and I look forward to the conversation. So I became interested in men's reproductive health really quite a long time ago. My first book was on the market for egg donors and sperm donors. And so I went around and interviewed staff working in sperm banks and staff at egg agencies about who they allowed to be a donor and how they marketed reproductive material from sperm donors and egg donors, how the donors themselves felt about having children out in the world. And so that book was called Sex Cells, C-E-L-L-S, and was this sort of comparative look at how gender and our ideas about gendered bodies shaped the market for egg donors and sperm donors. And so after finishing that book, I started noticing headlines about things like the male biological clock. Some of you may be familiar with Harry Fish's book from 2005. Researchers a couple of years later figured out that paternal age was associated with a higher risk of new mutations in sperm that were associated with an increased risk for things like autism and schizophrenia in children. That study was published in Nature and made the front page of the New York Times. For its part, you have sort of, the Mayo Clinic and their patient-friendly websites start to publish articles with titles like Healthy Sperm, Improving Your Fertility, and Men's Health magazine sort of run with this and build in all kinds of tropes of masculinity with titles like 4 ways to make your sperm stronger, faster, and more fertile, sort of drawing on these ideas of what it means to have very masculine sperm. So I had been already, doing research and thinking about sperm donors for about 10 years and began to see these headlines, 2005, 2010, 2012. And I just really was quite surprised, actually, that, some of this I would consider fairly basic information about how men's own reproductive health matters for the health of their children, and kind of led me to this question of, why did it take so long to begin asking some of these very basic questions? If we think about the century plus research into every tiny aspect of women's health and women's bodies and women's behaviors, and how everything that women eat or drink or breathe, or, and even way back when women, what they were thinking about were believed to affect reproductive outcomes. And so the question really that sort of led me to write this book, Gynecology, G-U-Y, Gynecology, the missing science of men's reproductive health, was really this question of why did it take so long to even start to pose the question about how men's health matters. So this book came out from University of California Press about a year ago. And I'm happy to talk in Q&A about its life after publication. The things I'm going to be talking about in the talk are what I did in order to research and write the book, but it's had sort of an interesting afterlife and has taken me into new conversations, including this one about male contraception, where I was not sort of seated before. So in writing this book and in thinking about sort of how did we get to a place where basic information about men's reproductive health was really brand new information 10, 15 years ago. I am sitting, I think it's helpful, the audience I assume is sort of from various backgrounds and various disciplines and various sort of positions with an interest in men's reproductive health. I sit in a community of social scientists, so sociologists, anthropologists, historians, who really think about reproduction as a case through which we can understand things like how is medical knowledge made and what kinds of effects does medical knowledge have on clinical care or medical markets. So I just grab PowerPoint's art making functions, which makes it actually look like one of those old birth control pill packs. But here, if you think about sort of reproduction as a case that allows us sort of entree or access or ways of thinking about everything on this list, from scientific knowledge to clinical care, medical markets, how we think about sexed bodies, how it shapes individual experiences, who we define as family. And then, of course, every one of these things is shaped by the law and policies of any particular country, which sort of almost doesn't need stating when we're thinking about reproduction. So if you think about this as sort of a flat plane with arrows going from every circle to every other circle, that's the kind of literature and research community that I'm a part of. We're sort of interested in all the relationship of all these things. And if you want to read sort of a more academic treatment of the 30 seconds of things I just said, I wrote an annual review of sociology article about 5 or 6 years ago that sort of spells this out in a little bit more detail. And in this book on men's reproductive health in particular, I was very interested in the relationship between sort of our social norms, our social beliefs about gender, about maleness and femaleness and masculinity and femininity, and the way that that shapes medical knowledge making. So I approach medical knowledge as a social process. It happens, at particular times, in particular places. And the thing that I'm interested is in how people sort of unspoken beliefs about things like gender or race or sexuality really shape the kinds of research questions they ask and the kinds of data they collect, and then how they analyze that data. So in the book, I make an argument about sort of the long-standing claim in the literature on sort of male bodies being understood as standard bodies for biomedical research. So for most of the 20th century, a lot of medical research was just conducted on middle-aged white male bodies with the idea that it would sort of generalize to the rest of the population. So this sort of argument among women's health activists that this unspoken male standard really limited research about women's bodies in various ways. So that's a very longstanding, well-documented sort of argument that exists. Equally longstanding is an argument about women's bodies being seen as reproductive bodies and primarily studied as reproductive bodies. But I think when you put these two approaches to human bodies and gender and medical knowledge making right next to each other, this is where you can see gaps start to emerge. So male bodies were standard, but we knew very little about how they mattered for reproductive outcomes, for example. So that's a gap in knowledge about men's reproductive health. Male bodies were standard, but women's bodies were reproductive. So research was not done on men's reproduction. And I'll just give you another example of this, one that I just sort of briefly reference in the book, but I think this is not just a social process that happened around men's reproductive health, but has happened in other cases, and that's for cardiovascular disease in women. So because women's bodies were seen as reproductive, research on heart attacks and heart disease were primarily done on men's bodies, which led to this gap in this lack of knowledge about how heart disease manifests in women's bodies, how heart attacks feel differently, which was sort of just kind of brought to the attention of clinicians and thus the general public in the last, decade or two. So this is another example of sort of thinking about men as standard and women as reproductive. These come together to lead to these gaps in knowledge. So that's sort of what I would consider the kind of big theoretical contribution of the argument of the book. And I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the empirical findings, some of the things that I found about how it was that we got to a missing science of men's reproductive health, and then the clinical and social and even political implications of our lack of attention to men's reproduction. So here I'll just sort of describe to you that I collected data about 3 different aspects of medical knowledge making, one of them being the production of medical knowledge about men's reproductive health. And then once the knowledge is produced, there's a question about, does it circulate from the realm of biomedical research and clinical care to a broader public? And then once it circulates, then how do individual people, men and women, how do people receive that? How do they react to learning this information? So this is sort of another approach in sociology to knowledge making, to think about production and circulation and reception. We also think of all of these as affecting each other. So this is not, it's arrayed hierarchically only because I don't know how to make a slide go on its side. But you can imagine that sort of arrows going all the way from each of these. So for each of these elements, I collected a different set of data for the production of knowledge. You can have a moment here where you feel gratitude to my research assistants who looked at all the JAMA articles that contain the word sperm or its cognates from when JAMA started publishing in 1883 to 2014. So we looked at all the articles on sperm and looked at particularly at which of them were sort of focused on the question of paternal effects, which is this category of factors of men's paternal age, their own bodily health, their exposures, how these things can affect sperm in such a way that might affect children's health. So we were really focused here on paternal effects. And then we did a sort of, not a formal meta-analysis, but we looked pretty closely at the scientific literature on paternal effects for the last 50 years. Various kinds of documents about medical specialties, and I did oral history interviews with 10 people in fields like urology and andrology who had been involved in sort of some of this scientific research. And then to check to see, to what extent was this new information on paternal effects really circulating to a broader public, we also had a systematic sample of all the New York Times articles on sperm for the past 50 years, looked at organizational statements, consumer websites and books. And then I did interviews with 40 men and 15 women from the general public to sort of get a sense from them about how they think about men's role in reproduction, whether or not they had heard any of this new information about men's reproductive health. And interestingly, and sort of aligned with what I've said about how clinicians have not paid attention to men's reproductive health, neither have sociologists. So when we do interviews with people about reproduction, we tend to interview women about contraception and abortion and birth and pregnancy. We just have interview study after interview study with women. And so this is actually one of the first interview studies with men from the general population about how they think about their role in reproduction, which is kind of stunning given that it's 2021. So that's sort of an overview of all the data that went into the book. The book is organized sort of in those three categories as well. There's 2 historical chapters where I look at sort of from the kind of initial days of medical specialization at the end of the 19th century. I look at sort of the emergence of OB and GYN as 2 of the earliest and largest specialties. So from very early on, women's reproductive bodies sort of get hived off from the rest of medicine. And these OB and GYN start out as separate specialties. They merge in the 1920s, but they were very large, very quickly institutionalized. They had their own journals, they had their own clinics. And so you have this sort of feedback loop of the making of knowledge about women's reproduction, which leads then to more funding and the networks around people who are studying these things, and they're running clinics. So they've got more women's bodies in the clinics to do research on. In the 1920s, that manifests with estrogen being discovered a little bit earlier than testosterone. We get a contraceptive pill for women in the 50s. We still don't have a contraceptive pill for men, right? So there's sort of this feedback loop of women and reproduction and scientific knowledge making, and women and reproduction and scientific knowledge making, such that you have the knowledge accretion over the course of the 20th century, and almost like a non-feedback loop for men, right? There's not a medical specialty for men. There's no men's reproductive health clinics. There's just not the group of people that are going to the same conferences and working together. So there's a couple of fits and starts where people try to start specialties or they try to start research, but it just doesn't take off. And we on this call today are living with the consequences of that failure to have any sort of umbrella specialty that is primarily focused on men's reproductive health. So that's sort of a description of the history, again, in very, very, very short amount of time. I'm going to kind of click through some of this. Well, let me say just a few words about andrology. So there was this attempt in the 1880s where OB and GYN had formed. There was a number of clinicians who said, we really need a parallel specialty for men. Why don't we call it andrology? And so there was a group of medical school professors from New York City, so very elite physicians. They started the American Association for Andrology. Edward Lawrence Keyes is involved in sort of setting that up. And it leads to an editorial in JAMA in 1891 about, this is so great. We have andrology as a specialty. Maybe this will put men's sort of reproductive organs on as high a plane as gynecology. This is really wonderful. But within a couple of years, they had just basically been laughed out of medical conferences, there's pages in medical journals sort of making fun of this new specialty. The problem was that men's reproductive health at the time was primarily a matter of venereal disease, to use the language of the day. So syphilis, gonorrhea were epidemic. There weren't good treatments. So these doctors were trying to specialize in something that was extremely stigmatized, right? We're in the Victorian era. People are having sex outside of wedlock and getting diseases and then trying to find a doctor who will treat them. So the kind of this noxious mix of masculinity and morality at the end of the 19th century leads the andrologists to really backpedal. So they say, okay, actually, we're not andrologists. We're going to be genitourinary surgeons. And by 1905, there was an effort to really drop the genito, and they become urologists. And so to this day, we have some urologists who specialize in men's, male fertility or men's reproductive health. But urology is really a specialty for the urinary tract. And part of that is because of these decisions made at the beginning of the 20th century about who they were and what they were going to study. All right. So that brings us up to, I'm going to just kind of fast forward us to the present moment. And so now we are living in a period where men's reproductive health, male contraception, paternal effects, these are now the subject of, at least some amount of research. We are now producing some knowledge around these things, which is great. The question is, how does that circulate, right? There's no sort of American Association for Men's Reproductive Health that is like the kind of megaphone for translating some of this biomedical research that's happening to a broader public. So one of the things my research assistants and I did was we went and looked at all the federal health agencies and any of the medical associations that would plausibly have anything to do with reproduction. And we looked for anything on their website about men's reproductive health, about male fertility, about paternal effects. So here's the list of the federal agencies and the various medical associations that we looked at. Many of these would have something about male fertility, but almost none of them said anything at all about paternal effects. So there might be something about, men's diet or alcohol consumption or other things causing damage to sperm, especially in terms of sperm count or motility or morphology, but they almost never take the next step to say, there's also now research that shows it doesn't affect only the sperm cell, but also the genetic material inside of it, such that it may have health implications for a man's children. That message is just absolutely not getting out there. The one place where we came the closest to finding something about this was on the CDC website, their Preconception Health and Healthcare Initiative, Information for Men. I will just tell you as a sociologist, nobody would ever search this ever. This is not a well-known phrase that anybody is familiar with. And in fact, the CDC's Preconception Health Initiative really was quite oriented to women. And so for those of you who are interested, Miranda Wagoner is one of my colleagues, sociology, who has a book on this called The Zero Trimester. This was really all about women's pre-pregnancy care. And in fact, what the CDC did was they took women's preconception health page, copied, paste, changed the pronouns to men, and then you get this website. This is one of the only websites in all of the federal health agencies that say anything about preconception health for men, and it still doesn't get to the details of things like sperm, sort of effects of sperm on children's health. Okay, so then I'm going to take you to the last couple chapters of the book where I was interviewing men about how they think about reproduction and their role in reproduction and reproductive health. And the whole sort of point of doing all of that, build up about, the history of inattention to men's reproduction, the lack of circulation of this information to a broader public is really to get to the point where we are now, which is to say, in a world where we pay almost no attention to men's reproduction, there's a huge vacuum of research. And the small amount of research that is done really doesn't get distributed more broadly. How is it that men out there in the general public think about their role in reproduction, right? How do they, like a basic sort of conceptual landscape of how they think about it? So I developed sort of two different interview questions and wrote a chapter about each of these. So the first one was, how do men and women think about a man's role in reproduction or define it? And then how do they react to some of this new medical knowledge about paternal effects? And so I'll just briefly say that, when I asked men, and I'm happy to talk about this is sort of how I did recruitment. When I asked men, if somebody asked you to define a man's role in reproduction, how would you define that? And I just got these blank stares and long pauses. This is one of the examples from Nathan. He says, a man's role in reproduction. Wow. Man's role. I never thought about that before. I don't think it would be too different from a woman's role. Can you rephrase the question? Right? So these pauses are really, in my mind, about the sort of lack of a ready-made cultural script about what a man's role in reproduction is. I mean, so there were certainly men who were a little surprised when the interview went from sort of men's life experiences and thinking about family and children and all of this to sort of asking this question. So some of the pauses are like, okay, what are we talking about now? But also they had some of them had really never thought about this question and certainly never been asked to say it out loud. So I think the sort of lack of attention that we give to this topic more generally shows up in men's answers. Now, once they stumble around a bit, there was sort of a surprising amount of consistency in how they ended up defining a man's role in reproduction. So it involved having sex, providing sperm, And then more generally being the provider, right? The sort of cultural sort of norm we have of men as breadwinners, and they're going to be the caretakers, the supporters, they're going to safeguard everybody, right? And so the sort of idea that men are involved in reproduction via the sexual act, via providing the sperm, and then being a dad. And you'll just notice with Gary's quote here about being a provider, there's no pauses, there's no stumbles. And this was true. I heard something along these lines from almost everybody I interviewed, and everybody could sort of roll this off their tongue, even if they themselves didn't sort of live up to this ideal in this way. And I just think that's an important contrast to like thinking about how men think about their role in reproduction. So because there were, because there's been so little attention, there's so little circulation, I ended up actually creating my own flyer of paternal effects, sort of how men matter for reproductive outcomes. And so after we talked generally about how men think about their role in reproduction, I handed them this flyer. It was called Healthy Sperm. Here's what you can do to make sure your sperm are healthy. And then I just said, walk me through your reactions. And so this was very interesting because I really wasn't sure what men were going to say. I could imagine sort of people pushing back and saying, oh no, it's really women's bodies that matter, women's behaviors. But in fact, every single man I interviewed said something along the lines of like, well, of course I would do everything possible to give my children the best chance in life. And so that I think is, not a surprising answer. And in fact, in sociology, we would call that social desirability bias, where people tell you what you think, what they think you want to hear and what they know that they're supposed to say. And so my next interview question was like, okay, think about the average man, how would he respond to learning some of this information about how men's health matters for reproductive outcomes? And that's where I got all kinds of answers about all the barriers that would stand between an individual man and healthy sperm, including cultural norms of masculinity, that men think they're invulnerable and would never ever take advice like this. That a lot of people spoke to sort of the gap between health intentions and health behaviors, that of course everybody intends to be healthy, but there's a lot that stands between people and being able to achieve that. And then importantly, many of the men pointed to extremely sort of structural systemic problems in the United States, in particular about lack of access to healthcare, about racial and economic inequalities and the ways these affect health, about contaminants in the air and water that is the province of no one individual person. So for all of these reasons, men were able to say, like, this is great to know and I'm happy to know it, but here's all the ways that I think we have a long way to go before we can sort of take on this advice about how men can sort of maximize their own individual reproductive health. And the first thing to do is sort of start thinking about these things systemically and structurally, and what kinds of public health decisions can we make that would improve the health of every body, regardless of whether or not they were reproducing. So that brings me to the conclusion where, with this book, and then in some of the sort of steps that I've taken after its publication to write op-eds and articles in magazines for a broader audience, speaking with clinicians at healthcare conferences, conversations like this, really I'm trying to reach a number of different audiences. But those audiences include my fellow social scientists, biomedical researchers, healthcare providers, and public health policymakers. So there's different audiences, but there's one message that I'm trying to get across to all of them, which is we need to pay more attention to men's reproductive health. And I recognize I am speaking to the choir probably a little bit with this bumper sticker conclusion here. So let me be a little bit sort of more detailed about what I hope each of these audiences would take from a study like this. So for my fellow social scientists, again, sort of back to this idea that, gender matters in the making of knowledge. It also matters in the making of non-knowledge. And this is a case of non-knowledge, right? Our lack of information about men's reproductive health is a systemic, ongoing, socially produced lack of information. And so we have to think about how to address that with sort of the institutionalization of knowledge-making processes around men's reproductive health, which can take a lot of different forms. For biomedical researchers, anybody who is doing any sort of research on pregnancy outcomes, and there's a lot of it, if they are ignoring women's male partners And that includes sperm donors, right? It doesn't have to be a male partner they're involved with. If they are ignoring paternal effects, they are missing some unknown amount of reproductive risk that is associated with male bodies prior to conception. So I think we have a lot of work to do here to figure out exactly how much risk we're talking about. How much risk does paternal age plus paternal health plus paternal diet and exposures, how much do these add up to? And it might, it's a non-zero number, but we don't actually know how big it is. So we're a long way away from being able to provide sort of detailed risk information to individuals, but it doesn't mean we can't let men know that their age and health and exposures matter. Healthcare providers. So this is the one that is, an interesting one, and we've sort of started to have some of these conversations, between Logan and Heather and myself, of sort of healthcare providers and how to think about incorporating men into reproductive healthcare. So I sort of got to the conclusion of the book, and I was not sure, was I going to argue there should be a parallel specialty for men's reproductive health next to OBGYN? But in fact, I think that's not the right move. There is a gigantic infrastructure built up for reproductive healthcare already. It is sort of implicitly associated with women's bodies. Think Planned Parenthood, think regular OBGYN appointments, right? Sort of all the ways we sort of constantly are working with women about reproductive health care and providing reproductive health care. That umbrella of reproductive health care is technically gender neutral. It's starting to stretch already to include people who are transgender, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary. So there's already an awareness that it's not only people who identify as women who need reproductive health care. And I think we should actually just stretch it a little further to include men. So people, either they were assigned male at birth or they currently identify as men. I think working with the existing infrastructure and expanding it to include the health of all bodies makes a lot more sense than trying to build up a whole new separate side specialty, which would have another potential sort of negative implication in my mind of reinforcing the idea that there is a gender binary where the bodies just come in male or female varieties. We know from a lot of research that things are much more complicated than that on terms of chromosomes and genitals, and not to mention social identities. So I think incorporating men into already existing reproductive healthcare is the way to go. And then finally, for public health policymakers, there is just almost no information among the general public about paternal effects. So we need some basic public health campaigns here. I actually, in doing research for the book, I found that the March of Dimes did run a campaign about men's reproductive health and paternal effects in the early 1990s, and was able to interview some of the people behind that. So I used to say that there have never been a public health campaign, but there has been at least one. It was relatively short-lived, but I think that there's a lot of room to move here in terms of how to think about how to do that creatively. So thank you so much for your attention and for the opportunity to present. I am very happy to take questions, engage in any sort of conversation that would be useful, brainstorm ideas, any way we want to go with this. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Renee. Really appreciate that. That was fantastic. And I think I want to kick things off because I think, as I shared with you in advance of the lemonade stand, reading the book really kind of opened our eyes to this massive, not only dearth of knowledge out there, but also what an incredible opportunity for us as an organization to actively try and fill that gap, which led to us developing all of this whole series of primers and animated shorts about male reproduction and contraception. And obviously, as most of us on this call, we would greatly benefit from an expanded understanding of men's reproductive biology. So I guess, what are some of the things, thinking, and you are talking to the choir, but just thinking about how, we as individuals and organizations, kind of changing the narrative and the entire conversation around reproduction seems so intimidating, such a lofty aspiration. But what are some of the things that we could do today? What are some of the steps that you think we could take today to be better advocates for this expanded understanding of men's role in reproduction?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think the sort of the production of things like fact sheets, tweets are very ephemeral, but they reach a wide audience. Podcasts, just website. Like, I was very surprised in 2015 when we went to just do some Googling, and then we looked more systematically at these various organizations. I was shocked that the American Urological Association, for example, did not have a whole lot of fact sheets on men's reproductive health. And in fact, they did not have any. They had stuff on male fertility, but that is only one aspect of men's reproductive health. So I think to think about, first of all, what men's reproductive health as a phrase consists of, which can include men's sort of own bodily health, which is going to affect the health of their sperm if they are planning or thinking about having children, access to male contraception, male fertility, so male infertility if fertility becomes a problem. And then there's sort of the various kinds of things that are typically associated with, people hear men's reproductive health. I think a lot of people think sexual health also. So erectile dysfunction and prostate cancer. So there's a lot of sort of individual, like I think of them as sort of individual bullets that are the province of different specialties. But if you actually brought them together for a holistic look at men's reproductive health as an entity, and then there was a lot of different places people could get information about those issues. It's a really small step, but I think it's actually super important, especially for sort of men out there in general, who, if they had heard, when I said, have you heard any of this before, and if you've heard of it, where have you heard of it? And they would say things like Men's Health Magazine and Facebook. The men I interviewed said that in general, the last time they heard anything about their own reproductive health was in high school. And that's if they went to a high school where there was some sort of health class that talked about sex, which is now, we know, many states no longer allow this to happen. So we're really talking about, that's another place that I think, this is now getting to be a longer answer, but that's another place I think actually interventions would be quite helpful, would be high school level curriculums for health, and then for states that have it for sex ed. Because I think this is one of the last chances you have to reach men in general. They're not going to doctors on a regular basis through adulthood like women are. So they can hit the last pediatrician appointment at the age of 17 or 18, and then they're going in for their colonoscopy at 45 or 50, right? And they're not seeing anybody in between who's asking them anything or telling them anything about reproductive health. So I actually think high school teachers have a lot to contribute here.
Oh, that's tremendous. And that hits fairly close to home, because you just completely described my experience with availing doctors. We have a question from Dana, so I'll throw it to Dana.
Dinah, but that's okay.
Dinah, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Hi, I'm a biologist specializing in reproduction, and I've been looking into what they're doing in Germany, and I don't know if you've seen this. They are starting up andrology as a subject. I think it's going through the Charité in Berlin, but I think they started a department on that, and they're trying to spread that through Germany and possibly throughout the EU. So I don't know. I'll be happy to, if you know any andrologists, I'll be happy to take down their numbers and contact them. But otherwise, just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So one of the things that I sort of quickly skipped over while I talked about the 20th century in about 3 minutes was that the second chapter of the book actually looks quite deeply at the emergence of andrology again in the 1960s. And so there was sort of this moment where andrology tried in 1880, it totally falls flat. And in the 1960s, you get a number of different scientists and clinicians from different fields, including reproductive biology, dermatologists. We still sort of had that link between sort of venereal disease and skin lesions for dermatology. And it's actually a German who starts up a journal called Andrology in a German journal in 1969 and relaunches andrology. And it took them about 20 years to figure out that they were not the first to call for andrology as a specialty that would parallel gynecology. And so this is absolutely a national story. So what I've been talking about is the United States, where there is the American Society, but there is a small number of people who identify as andrologists. Many of them are basic scientists, but some of them work in sperm banks and fertility clinics. I think there's about 600 andrologists in the US. In other countries, it's more of a developed subspecialty or sort of an area of concentration, including places like Germany and Italy. But in general, they sort of focus more on male fertility and also aging men, diseases of aging in men. So nowhere have I been able to find any country where there is sort of this, what I think of as kind of a specialty that is solely focused or sort of holistically focused on men's reproductive and sexual health, in which you have, residency programs and classes in medical school and places where you can go to really focus on that. We have that for male fertility, but I really think of male fertility as only one element of men's reproductive health. So yeah, if you want more on andrology as a specialty, sort of in the latter part of the 20th century, that would be chapter 2.
Awesome, thanks. There's a question in the chat. I'm going to read that first, and I'll throw it to you, Dom. From John, he asked, have you thought about the role of ethics in the bleak landscape of men's reproductive health?
Yes. Okay, good. Oh, there's some good things in the chat. Okay, I've not figured out the Zoom way of like both talking and reading at the same time and responding. So I appreciate you reading them out. So I think the issue of ethics here is manifold. And so I will just say too, that there's a whole world of sort of bioethicists who sort of think in very structured way about ethics. I do not approach ethics in that way. So when I sort of think about the potential, the kind of potentially positive implications of looking more at men's reproductive health and the potential consequences of doing so, I think I do so from a more kind of sociological and even political perspective. So one of the potential concerns that I have, which some people may think of as an ethical concern, is one that I mentioned already about sort of reifying the gender binary by saying men's reproductive health. It makes it seem as though the category men is a stable thing. And I think at this particular moment, I think of men and male as more like an assumption container. And it contains assumptions about a particular kind of body that has XY chromosomes and certain levels of testosterone and certain genitals and a certain gender identity, right? So if we think of male as an assumption container and female as an assumption container, one that we've lived with them for quite a while. There's a lot of biological and medical research agendas built on top of those assumptions, but those are really coming into question. So both by people who are sort of trans scholars and activists, but also by people who are pointing to the fairly common sort of occurrence of children who are born intersex, where they don't neatly fit into either male or female. And so what does this do to our thinking about any medical topic and reproductive health in particular, if we can't sort of rely on an assumption that bodies come in 2 flavors? So that's a big one for me. And that's what I've spent quite a lot of time doing since the book came out, is thinking about the fact that I wrote a book that has men's reproductive health in the title. I'm like, I don't really even know what that means anymore. So that's one of them. The other one is because I, a long time ago before graduate school, worked at the National Abortion Federation in Washington, D.C., and was very enmeshed in sort of what was at the time pro-choice politics, and now sort of moved into sort of more of a view around reproductive justice. And so at a moment where basic access to contraception and abortion is probably under the most severe threat that it's been under, certainly in my lifetime, that I think the politics of thinking about men's reproductive health, talking about it, doing anything that feeds into the notion that men should have any sort of power over women's reproductive decision-making is incredibly fraught. And so I do that carefully. I write about it both in the introduction and the conclusion to the book. And it's one of those tightropes. I think it's incredibly important actually to think about how bodies that we have historically categorized as male bodies, how their reproductive health matters, because I actually think that contributes to a political project of destabilizing the association of reproduction with women's bodies. And destabilizing that, if we lived in a world where men actually thought of their bodies as reproductive, I think sort of shakes up all kinds of assumptions that move well beyond the realm of health and medicine and into the realm of politics. So I do it carefully. I know that the men's rights people are going to say whatever it is they're going to say, and regardless of whatever I write in my book or whatever I say on a podcast. But I think that it's important to make those arguments, but to do so with a deep awareness of the political climate that we live in right now. So thank you very much for that question.
Great, thank you. And now I'll throw it to you, Dominic.
Yeah, I'm sorry I came a little bit late today. I really appreciate you presenting and your book. And I am curious, so you're here at the MCI, and we're talking about, we have John Townsend, whose question you just answered, did a bunch of work on different contraceptive methods for men, and Pop Council and other things like this, and other people here who are invested in this as a potential avenue of reproductive health. And I'm curious about your perspective on the viability and the market for this as it comes out. And also, if you have any suggestions around, I was waiting for you to give us the sexual reproductive health kind of comment, because a lot of the work that our teams do that are USAID funded and other things like that are really focused on gender norms, things like that around sexual reproductive health. They kind of build a foundation of awareness around their own men's and boys' reproductive health. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on the viability of those potential methods. And I know there's a lot of different ones, and each method will actually have a little bit different, different nuance in how they're marketed and proposed to potential users. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. That's a great question. And so this is one of the, it's been very interesting to me, and sort of the book coming out and then the new conversations that I get to join. So I am not going to presume in any way to have a good sense of all the different sort of male contraceptive options that are currently in development, and what is more likely. I would turn that question back to probably almost anybody else in this room. It was very interesting to me in researching and writing the book that I could see male fertility as sort of like a group of people here. There was a much smaller group that was sort of paternal effects researchers, and then there was sort of the male contraception people. And it may be that everybody is in conversation, but it sort of appeared to me like these were sort of somewhat separate networks, conversations, research agendas, whatever you want to sort of label those as. And for the book, I ended up actually focusing primarily on paternal effects as one of the newer arrivals, far newer than male fertility and male contraception, which has been, on the research agenda since at least the 1950s. But really sort of thinking about paternal effects as like a newer arrival to this umbrella of men's reproductive health, and what was the evidence base for those claims, and were they being circulated, and had men heard them? So it was almost as if it was a little bit of a sort of pragmatic decision about the book couldn't be 500 pages long. It was, 250 pages. And other people had written about male fertility. And I just viewed male contraception as something that a couple of different sociologists and anthropologists have written a little bit about. So here, somebody like Nellie Uchhorn, who has written about the male pill as a technology in the making. That book came out in 2002, and here we are in 2021. It's still a technology in the making. But to sort of, so what I'm saying in a very long-winded way is I did not delve deeply, but since the book has come out, I have been having a number of conversations with a number of different organizations who are like, we work on male contraception and we need these insights about men's reproductive health more broadly in order to figure out who might take this and how to pitch it and all of that. So I really welcome these conversations. I feel a little bit out of my element because I don't have the deep historical or sociological background. I have had conversations with people like David Nguyen at USC, who has done some of the qualitative interviews with men in Los Angeles, for example, Black men and poor men, about, if there was this thing, how would you react? So there's, some of these interview studies are out there. But I think to approach male contraception as this socially embedded technology, that if and when we ever do get it, right, it is not, the technology itself is not going to determine its use or how people react to it. And so having a sort of very deep understanding of how men think about their reproductive bodies and what it is they are willing to consider doing and for what reasons, right, for their own health, for maybe partnerships that they are in, for their children's health. We are just starting to scrape the surface in terms of having an understanding of how men think about these issues. So I think that's where, sociologists and anthropologists probably have a lot to contribute. And in partnering with organizations like MCI to either do those interviews or to help guide some of the research design issues that would come out of it. So I really appreciate the question. I'm very happy to continue the conversation with anybody who wants to talk further afterwards or email me or whatever. Either I can provide feedback on it. I have graduate students who want to do research. I think there's a lot of places, for collaboration there.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Now we have a few minutes left. So Stephen, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So one of the things that's come out in the recent past is that Down syndrome is not a female problem anymore. It's now both female and men. And so one of the ways I think that a lot of men could be scared silly into thinking about what their obligations are is that they do not have forever to have children the way that has sort of been in the popular culture for too long. That's all I want to say.
Yeah. So this actually gives me the opportunity to stand up on another one of my sort of like ethical considerations, ethical concerns. One of the things that I don't want to do is take all of the anxiety and stress that women feel about pregnancy and just spread that around to everybody else, right? I don't think we have done a good job of reproductive health messaging with women. I think we send out individualized messages saying it's all about you, individual person, and what you purchase and your healthcare and what you do with your body. And it ends up stigmatizing people and making them feel paralyzed and anxious and terrible. So I actually, in the book, write about how we should sort of take advantage of the newness of the idea of paternal effects to rethink reproductive health messages more broadly, where we're not just sending out messages about individual health behaviors, but about the ways that we as a society have made it very difficult for people to be healthy. And that is because of massive inequalities associated with race and with class and with gender and with sexuality. It has to do with how we've organized healthcare in this country. So here I just go into the diatribe that anybody who's ever been interested in public health or epidemiology or medical sociology has heard a million times. We know what to do to make our society healthier. We just have to go ahead and do it. And so I definitely think, it is possible to hear this and say, yes, we should, scare men and tell them, and I know that that's not what the question was saying, but I think to sort of make the information available and figure out how to present this information in a way that doesn't individualize and stigmatize people even more than they already are.
That is fantastic. I think it's a perfect place to wrap things up. So we're almost at time. It's thank you so much, Rene. That hour just flew right by, and it was very, very just rejuvenating to hear, and just really exciting to think about the potential of a future in which reproductive health is just not gendered at all. We just don't say male or female; it's just reproductive health. So thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today. Thank you all for attending. We'll be sharing a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel and our websites. Please sign up for our newsletter. Go to malecontraceptive.org to hear about future lemonade stands. And hopefully we will get Rene back for another session soon. But thank you all again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Bye.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.